this landscape. Bukit Brown, as you know, was part of a larger landscape that extended a little bit further. You will know that today when you come to Bukit Brown, you will see a rather large highway cutting through a chunk of the cemetery. So what you are seeing is that the landscape here is a bit different. Some of that greenery is now split into two parts. You've also got more disturbance in the landscape, but at the same time, I think more people are also aware of this place. And I think in the old days, I don't think you will see such large crowds coming here every day. So I think Bukit Brown in some ways have changed for the better as far as people's awareness are concerned. But I think you also find that the ecology of Bukit Brown is a bit more fragmented than what it was. Yeah.
Can you talk about, maybe in as much detail as possible, how does the fragmentation, what do you mean by fragmentation? What does it mean in terms of maybe trying to use like the idea of networks and old growth and new growth to talk about what this fragmentation means?
So if you look around Bukit Brown, much of what you see today is really secondary forests. Before the highway was built, what we then had was a far smaller road called Lornie Road, and on one side you've got Bukit Brown and some residential area, and then on the other side you've got the Central Catchment Forest, which is the nation's largest forest. So when the highway was built, some conditions in this landscape will be changed in irreversible ways, right? For example, when you have a larger road, you're going to create more disturbance from sound. The whole process of constructing this highway, of course, will cause a lot of disturbance to wildlife and animals. And when you build roads across a landscape like this, you are basically severing the ecological connection, so species will find it more difficult to disperse across, especially when the road is very large. So some of these birds that are not such good flyers, they would not be able to cross the road so easily. For mammals, even probably worse, because mammals, when they try to cross the roads, it's very dangerous for them. So when you build a road through a green landscape, you are causing ecological breakage. However, I think what the authorities have done well is that they have actually thought quite a lot about how this highway was going to be built. So there are some areas that are elevated above the ground, which means that animals can still move below it. I think there's also a little bit of water features there that has been preserved by keeping the highway above the ground. So I think we can be it's unfortunate that the highway is built. If it wasn't built, then this would have been a far less disturbed landscape. But now that it's built, I think some action have been taken to mitigate the changes in the terms of the kinds of disturbance Bukit Brown faces. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between new growth and old growth in Bukit Brown, but also like relating to MacRitchie and maybe the Singapore landscape? What's the difference? Why is it important to keep old growth?
So Bukit Brown is a very young forest, a secondary forest that has not been here for more than a few decades, right? And forests over time will regenerate naturally, but newly regenerated forests, they would have particular kinds of plants that are characteristic of those kinds of forests. You'll find certain trees, certain bushes that are, when you see it, you know that okay, we are talking about secondary forests. But on the other side of the highway, we have the Central Catchment. Right adjacent to the highway is the MacRitchie Forest, and many of us who have been to MacRitchie Forest know that MacRitchie Forest is quite undisturbed. There are lots of large old trees in MacRitchie. A lot of ecologists consider MacRitchie to be among the oldest forests left in Singapore. Just like Bukit Timah, I think about close to 100 hectares of MacRitchie forest can be considered as old growth. Some people even use the term virgin forest. So the thing about virgin forests that they are extremely rich in animal species and plant species. So if you go to a virgin forest, you'll see, and if you go to a virgin forest and you look at different kinds, look at all the plants carefully, you'll find that there are many different types of plants in them. And for the trees, you will see very many large trees in virgin forests. So I think Bukit Brown, if left on its own and without the highway and all that, it is possible that over time, many of the species that come from the MacRitchie virgin forest, the better quality forest of MacRitchie, would be able to colonize Bukit Brown. Just a bit of quick comparison between what you will consider as old growth or virgin forest in MacRitchie and secondary forests here in Bukit Brown.
Why is it important to have this rich number of plants and hold on, I'm going to try to move my camera
Okay.
to face. Can we, just because I keep getting the buses sound?
Oh, okay, the buses are.
Yeah, because
We should close the highway for about
yeah, I think so. Can you shift your chair a little bit over?
Okay.
Yeah, but the same angle, yeah.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shaky?
Okay.
Yeah. I think. Yeah. So I think one of the most important things to think about when we look at the highway and Bukit Brown and central catchment is the concept of ecological connectivity. When we think about ecological connectivity, you think of networks of natural sites where species can move around from one area to the other area. So with the highway being a physical structure, is effectively a physical barrier, right? And this is a pretty large highway. It's got, I think, 8 lanes, 4 on either side. So to build a highway, you are technically bisecting what you could see as a connected landscape. You've got animal species moving from MacRitchie to Bukit Brown. There are animal species moving from Bukit Brown to MacRitchie. We know that's happening because scientists and ecologists, we've come here, we've surveyed this area, and we've seen species that are normally associated with MacRitchie here. So we know that species are moving from there to here, and vice versa. So the construction of the highway is one step in reducing that connectivity between the ecosystem of Bukit Brown and the ecosystem of MacRitchie, which was once upon a time more continuous and connected and part of a network. So I think that is one of the key ideas that I would like to flag when we look at how the environment in Bukit Brown has changed when they built this new road across here.
Can you repeat the part, because I think the sound here is better now, the part where without a barrier, there is the plants could colonize from MacRitchie, the virgin forest from MacRitchie could colonize, and also like using the word colonize because that's also one of our keywords.
Yeah, so it's a very good point. Yeah, so plants disperse, right? They disperse their seeds, and if the seeds get its way to some other landscape, they may grow in that landscape. So the way I see it is that MacRitchie is a source of species. And because of the proximity of MacRitchie to Bukit Brown, species from MacRitchie can colonize the ecosystem of Bukit Brown if you leave it untouched over time. So a lot of these large old trees are species that are typically characteristic of like old forest, right, virgin forest. Some of these plants could easily spread over, by wind, by other animals, or by mechanical dispersive methods. So by creating a barrier there, you are, well, I wouldn't say it totally stops dispersal of plants and animals, but it would reduce that. So it make it more difficult for species from the central catchment forest to colonize Bukit Brown.
Oh yeah, we can talk about what do you man-made nature in Singapore, maybe specifically in Gardens by the Bay. I mean, we hope that we can interview in Gardens by the Bay, but
Okay.
just in case we don't have time,
Okay.
yeah, we would like to ask you about it. Like, what does it mean to have? I think in Singapore, we take down a lot of old forests, and we are very green generally.
Mhm.
So we do have, what does this man-made nature and plants
Even
mean?
like all those like small like mini forests created within a building or something.
Mm.
I see a lot of them.
Yeah, I think Singapore's the city landscape of Singapore is a collision between humans and nature. The landscape of Singapore has been drastically changed for 180 years, even longer perhaps. And as the city grows, I think actually coming back to my earlier point, even by the time Singapore became an independent country, there was not so much virgin forest left. A lot of this secondary forest that we have seen today has regenerated over time, because back in the days a large part of the country were under cultivation, so there were rubber plantations, there are fruit orchards, and these rubber plantations and fruit orchards are now abandoned, so nature eventually would come back. Nature is resilient if left untouched, and perhaps with a bit of assistance from people. Nature can come back easily to recolonize landscapes that it was not formerly found in. So Singapore is epitome, you could think of it as an epitome of this constant struggle between human construction and nature. Give you the example of Gardens by the Bay. I think we talked about Gardens by the Bay, right? Gardens by the Bay, as you know, is land that has been created from the sea. All that land that the gardens sit on right now was part of the Singapore Straits and the mouth of the Singapore and Kallang rivers. The government, of course, reclaimed a huge chunk of land there, and that land, when left over time, eventually become populated with species again, open country, animal species, grass species, bushes, and all that. Yeah. So and then now today, another 20-30 years down the road, you've got totally new landscape again, very much driven by human activity. I mean, the entire Gardens by the Bay is a man-made landscape. It's a man-made landscape with species that are artificially planted there. And there are also areas in Gardens by the Bay whereby the people who design it has had a think about ecological principles. They have designed some of these ponds, some of these areas with nature and how nature can colonize these landscapes in mind. So that is good, in a sense it helps nature to make a comeback over time. Yeah. I think it's very hard to say whether man-made nature is good or bad and compare that with old growth or virgin jungle. But I think what is really interesting for most observers, most ecologists and naturalists, is to see how nature is so resilient in spite of all this pressure from human activities, constructions, and all that. Yeah, these are some points that I would like to share. Yeah.
Great. Anything else?
Wondering, because we're basically trying to be critical about.
I think do a mix though.
It's
yeah.
a mix, but we also want, because we're seeing Gardens by the Bay as a simulacrum kind of concept, which is like there's like this like virgin forest.
Yeah. So I think coming back to the topic of nature, I think a lot of people in Singapore are very disconnected with nature. They say they tend to see nature as the other thing, or they may have very inaccurate perspectives of nature. They go to the park in their neighborhood and see all these nice planted bushes and trees, artificially planted bushes and trees, many of them which were shipped from other parts of the world, and look at it and say, yeah, this is nature. I'm really imbibing and soaking in the nature. I'm not sure if that's the best thing to do. But when we look at nature in Singapore, I think what strikes me is that the views on nature, opinions on nature tend to be that nature is good to be, it's got to be used. It's got to be used. It's got to have some outcome, some economic outcome. It can be showcased. And I think the people who came out with the Gardens by the Bay has done a pretty good job of trying to showcase nature and get some economic benefit out of it. So I find that in Singapore, the dominant view in terms of how we perceive nature is that it has to be showcased, it's got to be used, rather than more ecological perspectives of nature. So I think when people look at a landscape and decide what they want to build there, they were like, okay, we should have some bushes here. It needs to look good. It needs to look good. It needs to show control. We need to prune this. You need to cut the grass here. We've got to put some nice plants here. We need to impress people. We need to impress the foreigners. All this thinking have been put into how we curate our own perspectives on nature in Singapore. And therefore, you've got parks like Gardens by the Bay and all the other neighborhood parks and park connectors. Yeah. So I think that's one of the common views of how people in Singapore tend to perceive nature. I wouldn't say it's a wrong thing, but it's a common view. On the other hand, as an ecologist, I also tend to think a lot about the more ecological perspectives of nature, thinking about undisturbed ecosystems and the resilience of undisturbed ecosystems. A lot of ecologists around the world also have a strong view on how we need to protect undisturbed and virgin nature. We want to do this because we know that undisturbed forests have the most species, and protecting those kinds of landscape is also equally just as important. So I find that when we have all these discourses on nature in a city environment, there are all these competing views on what nature should be, what nature should do. Some people will say that nature should look nice and be under control by people. It needs to be pruned when needed. It needs to look majestic. It needs to be able to earn money. It needs to be able to impress people visiting the country. These are common narratives of what people see nature in Singapore. And then there's the more ecological narrative where we want nature to be undisturbed as much as we can, where we can help nature to regenerate by restoration. We should do that, and we should try to connect, fragments of vegetation left behind into larger fragments to allow species to move around. So two different perspectives of nature that we see in Singapore in constant competition with each other. As an ecologist, of course, you may say that some of my views are very extreme. If given an option, I would wish that much of Singapore is covered with undisturbed forests and nice coastlines that are natural. But I think, of course, there are many pressures as to how land is to be used, and so here we are in Singapore with this landscape, which is, I guess more than 90% of the landscape has been shaped irreversibly by man. I hope that was okay.
Oh, perfect.
Half the
Great.
time I have no idea what I'm talking
Oh
about.
no, you talk like you are. It's very clear, and it sounds like you're already like a finished paper.
Okay.
No, which is good, which is great. It's like very. I wouldn't be able to talk it with such clarity.
I did something similar with Robert because he asked me about my perspectives of Christmas Island.
Yeah.
About invasive species.
Yeah.
Invasive species is a very divisive topic, right? Some people, many ecologists like us, we hate invasive species. We want to get rid of them. But some ecologists say, actually, why do you want to waste money and time to get rid of them? Invasive species may be able to fulfill the roles that the species that are extinct could do in the past. Yeah.
Maybe one or two last question is, do we talk about it, like why is, like going back to why is a rich, like a forest with many species, why is it important, you know, for humans but also for nature? Why diversity is important?
I think diversity is important. I think you can apply different value systems to look at why diversity is important. But from an ecological point of view, diversity in the forest ecosystem is important because diversity in terms of species helps to keep the stability of the ecosystems, the relationships between different species in the forest in place. A lot of these rainforests that we see, you know, that you would consider as old growth, think of places like Bukit Timah. In Singapore, think of places like Bukit Timah, MacRitchie Forest. These are, well, old growth forests. They are very rich in species. There are probably 4 to 5 times more species in those forests than secondary forests. And they have been existing in a very stable way for a very long time. So many species have evolved in those forests. You've got very fine, complex relationships between plants and animals, animals and animals, plants and plants, plants and fungi, you know, fungi and animals. All these complex relationships, millions of them exist in a tropical rainforest ecosystem. And because of this complex interconnection between all these different species in the rainforest, we sometimes don't know which are the, you know, important connections that if we lose them, it will disrupt the overall functioning of the rainforest ecosystem. So for that purpose, to ensure the integrity of a forest ecosystem, diversity is a very important thing. And we know from science, from research, that diversity gets lower and lower when you put human disturbances into a landscape. So you chop here a little bit, you build a road here, you reduce the area of the forest, species will go extinct. Many of these species that have evolved in forests, they are very sensitive to environmental conditions. You could have an insect, you could have a frog that needs a particular kind of stream environment, you could have an insect that needs this kind of environment on a tree's trunk. And when those environments are lost due to disturbance, these animals just go extinct. And then when they go extinct, they affect other animals that eat them or have some ecological connection with them. So diversity is important in a nutshell to preserve the integrity of a forest. And when you disturb it, you cause diversity to be eroded. Species extinctions will happen, ecological relationships will be lost. Some of these ecological relationships, we probably don't even know it. Scientists haven't even looked at it in detail. So I think as an ecologist, that's why I think diversity is important, and that's why we need to preserve diverse rainforest habitats for as long as possible, keep as large areas as we can, and try to manage and bring human disturbance to as low a level as possible.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, the last thing is maybe just so we have the footage of just a very short description of Bukit Brown as a cemetery. So we can add it in the beginning. So like what I mean, like just basic, like this is a Chinese cemetery, and yeah.
So Bukit Brown is it's I think a lot of people think of Bukit Brown as a cemetery. I've read about Bukit Brown when I was a kid. I think I mentioned this before, because back in the days, nature lovers were already visiting this cemetery, which means something, right? When nature lovers come here, it means that there's a lot of nature here. And I only started to visit Bukit Brown for nature trips in the last couple of years. I think the pandemic has helped because I no longer get to move abroad, so I visit places like Bukit Brown and take long hikes, bird watching, photography, sound recording and all that. It's a really interesting landscape because as you can see, this area, it was obviously a cemetery. It's been a cemetery for a very long time in Singapore's history. Perhaps one of the oldest cemeteries we have in the nation, with lots of pioneering people buried here. It's also an interesting landscape where you see that nature has slowly reinvaded over time. So I think if you came to Bukit Brown a century ago, it would be a totally different landscape. It would be open, more like what you will see of some of these newer burial areas. But over 100 years, nature has steadily seeped in, and you can see within Bukit Brown areas of like fairly tall forest that has regenerated over time. So you see patches of secondary forest here and there, and of course as the forests start to regenerate within this cemetery with all the lack of disturbance, species are coming here. I think you've got things like pangolins in Bukit Brown. Pangolins probably recolonized from the catchment or other wooded areas further south. You've got long-tailed macaques in Bukit Brown, and I think for those people who have done bird surveys here, we know that there are more than 100 species of birds in Bukit Brown. That's an impressive number, including some really endangered species that you have here in Singapore. I think before we came into Bukit Brown proper today, we heard the straw-headed bulbuls, which are highly threatened species of birds that you can see at the edges of Bukit Brown. Yeah, so I think moving forward 100 years from when this cemetery was carved out, Bukit Brown is no longer just a resting place for the dead, but it's also a thriving haven for the living in terms of biodiversity.
Thank you.
I hope I Yeah, I think on the concept of nature and biodiversity, I think it's good to have a deeper think about what nature means in the context of Bukit Brown's landscape. Yeah, a lot of us ecologists and biologists, we tend to think of nature as the aggregate, the sum of plant species, animal species, all lumped together. That is nature. I think that is probably an inaccurate summary of nature. Nature is not just about the species. Nature is also about the processes that species are involved with in relation to their natural environment, the landscapes. So Bukit Brown is you could think of it as it's a setting where you can see various processes that drive nature happening here. Recolonization, regeneration of forests, extinction of species, recolonization of other species, species dispersal. All these things are happening within the Bukit Brown landscape, which makes it very diverse and worthy of further study, especially in relation to the central catchment, which is larger, has more species. Bukit Brown is smaller, has less species and more disturbances. But trying to see these two things together and understand the connections between the catchment forest and Bukit Brown, as part of a wider network, I think that's interesting for us to think about. Nature.